The Sound of Damian Wayne. Written by Magnoliabee. Read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 16. Author's Notes. Hi, I reread your comments all the time, so please know you're appreciated more than you'll ever be able to know. Lovely reader, enjoy the chapter. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on a bed in a small, one-room cabin. The air was fresh, unlike Gotham or cities. Humanity, too. It was an old wooden home he resided in, extremely rudimentary in design and amenities. There was a table off to the side, 3 chairs surrounding it. An axe was resting next to the bedpost. Damian pushed himself up, noting the darkness of the room, broken by a stream of light that crept in through the main door. He could hear humming outside, an almost ethereal sound that he found himself drawn to. Somehow, the humming was almost tactile in its softness. He crept forward, staying low as he made his way to the door. Damian held his breath as he pushed it open carefully. Warm light washed over him, the sweet buzz of summer alive and well. He smelled grass and sap, scents he hadn't experienced in so long. He felt unnaturally comfortable. Why was he here? Damian couldn't remember. Again, the hum caught his attention. It felt familiar, like home. Forest surrounded him. The cabin was situated in a lush clearing, and the sky above was blue and clear. A dark bird circled overhead, landing on top of the roof. His feet moved on their own, trailing around the side of the cabin to where the sound was coming from. He was in a haze as he walked, only stopping when he reached the source. A girl stood, tall and willowy in the grass, white flowers underfoot. There was an almost golden glow around her. Her hair was a sunrise, a flaming color that held his gaze. It should have made him feel unsettled. She was nearly unreal. But again, that strange softness in his head took control, a smile playing on his face as he watched her hum and braid grass in her hands. It felt like when he watched Dick at his best, a sense of awe and longing twisting in his gut. She looked up suddenly, a wide grin breaking over her face like dawn as his eyes met her own. Her hand was outstretched. He reached forward on instinct. She opened her mouth, saying something, but it was muffled. Still, that incessant feeling of sunlight bloomed in him. Their fingers touched, and he felt inexplicably warm, protected. Here, this was where he was supposed to be, right by her side. Damian woke up bundled in blankets on Dick's bed, gasping for air. He stared at the ceiling, his dreams still fresh in his mind. It seemed so real. Dreams tended to have that effect. But this one felt different, if only somewhat. It lingered as he sat up, stretching out the aches in his body. Flashes of yesterday appeared at the forefront of his mind. He tried to ignore them, but it was no easy task as he looked around him. Dick clearly hadn't slept there either, probably taking the couch for fear of upsetting Damian, or worse yet, jostling his injuries. Where he might have slept was cold and without imprint. It was coddling at its precipice. After his family's intrusion the night before, Damian had finally been allowed to leave after another 30 or so minutes of medical tests. Alfred had guessed anxiety to be the culprit behind his ailment, though still insisted Damian keep tabs on himself, in case his symptoms worsened. His temperature was off, as was his heart rate, slightly lower than it should have been, which perplexed Alfred. Thankfully, The cave had been mostly cleared out, with only Dick and Bruce remaining. Damian's father had knelt down, enveloping him in a hug. He hadn't quite known how to react. It had been a bit since they'd hugged. Neither of them employed physical displays of affection, usually. His father usually let his focus on his own worries speak for his care for his family. But his father had held him tighter than usual, not letting go until Damian finally twitched, the pressure on his bruising unpleasant at best.
"We'll get through this. I hope you know I'm always here for you."
The ride back was a blur. Damian wasn't exactly chatty on a normal day, but Dick hadn't bothered to pick up the slack. His expression had been numb, his lips only quivering every so often. It was unsettling. Tearing the blankets off, he gingerly got up. There wasn't really a point in hiding his pain. Not anymore. Still, he couldn't help the instinct, and he shuffled out the door, holding his chin in the air. Dick was standing in the kitchen. A few dishes were in the sink, yet to be washed. He looked terrible. His hair was messed up, a crease on his brow as he glanced at Damian. A tight smile overtook his face.
"You're up! That's great! That's great!"
His voice was muffled as he turned around, reaching up towards the cupboards. Dick did not look quite as shattered as he had the night before. It was a good change, Damian thought. Some progress had been made, at least. He still felt responsible, his bruises the catalyst for Dick's own suffering.
"Why don't you shower and then we can talk over breakfast, okay?"
Damian pursed his lips. He nodded, heading back to Dick's room. Alfred had sent him off with a backpack full of his clothing and toiletries. Damian rifled through it, carefully pulling out a pair of pants and a shirt that would suffice. He noted Alfred had only packed long-sleeved shirts, and he felt a wave of gratitude. He didn't need Dick being reminded of his physical state every time he so much as glanced at him, though he doubted Dick needed to see the bruises to be thinking about that. He locked himself in the bathroom, turning the shower on to its highest temperature. Steam filled the room as he attempted to clear his head. Clearly, Dick had intentions of questioning him. That was obvious. His family was already fully aware of his bruising. They could draw their own conclusions, as could Leah and the state court system. All that mattered was that he kept his secret just a bit longer. They couldn't know of his failure. If he had just a bit more time, he could figure it out. Then he'd be able to explain away the injuries when his voice returned, and pretend that everything was fine and that he was fine. Damian paused. Why would he do that? What did that gain him? His pride had already been taken from him, stomped on by everyone in his life. If anything, a curse was a much less embarrassing reason for his bruising than lying and saying he'd been trumped, especially as they would quickly notice he had failed to heal up. Bruises didn't stay vibrant for long. No one could feasibly fault him too much for the extent of his injuries. It was magic, and as the Nessentia provided, he wasn't meant for dealing with magic. He rested his head against the tile on the wall. Again, his instincts were misaligned with the logic that had been hammered into him his whole life. It was taking everything in him to convince himself that hiding was no longer an option, that it would only lead to destruction, perhaps his own demise. Damian thought back to his previous actions. In the beginning, he'd been more volatile. He had attempted to let the others in on the curse, though, admittedly, his attempts had been shoddy at best, and outright abysmal at worst. And then he just stopped trying altogether. Accepted that he was alone, that he could not try and warn the others. He dug his nails into his wrists, his breathing staggered. How had he not realized sooner? The curse was something more than he had first thought. Its boundaries went deeper, and that made sense. If the goal was his complete silence to protect the caster, then having him warn the people around him wouldn't do the caster any good. Melina likely had no idea what she had done. Whatever sort of curse she had inflicted upon him, it was much worse than she'd thought. He knew that already, but his realization of its possible mental effects quashed any double that he may have held. His decline, both physically and physiologically, was entwined with the curse in a way he couldn't have imagined. The quiet had caused him to spiral, his frustration boiling over as he couldn't even warn of his fate. But it had occurred quickly, more so than would be expected for himself. Damian was not a civilian. He was trained for psychological warfare. This was different, and he didn't know how to stop it. Damian sat next to Dick at the kitchen counter, looking at him warily. He tried to staunch his anger, but it was a tall order as Dick just stared, clearly collecting his thoughts. Damian wished he'd just get this over with. If it wasn't shameful enough that he'd gotten himself cursed by an incompetent, or perhaps dangerously capable witch, now he had Dick fawning over him like he was a child. A small part of him, that he chose to ignore, was upset that it had taken this long for someone to notice. He hadn't been subtle in his change of demeanor. Damian had become quiet and closed off, and that should have been enough. And they had noticed, but they hadn't confronted him outright. Had let him waste away until CPS had brought the issue up, making it a priority. Was he not a priority? Could he not be, just for once, worthy of any kind of scrutiny that was born of care? He was sick of it. The watching and waiting, the focus on strict procedures instead of impulse, a code that didn't align with Damian's own instincts.
Damian, I need to ask how you got those bruises.
His voice was hard. There was no longer any wavering. Any doubts had long since dissipated.
You got hurt. We all do, but last night, I saw a whole lot more bruises than could happen from training. Hell, even a one-off fight.
He fidgeted with his sleeve. His gaze dropped to the floor, pointedly away from Dick in this conversation.
Hey, I need you to look at me when I'm talking to you. This is serious. We both know that.
He narrowed his eyes.
They're all over you, Damie. Did someone do that to you?
Damian shook his head. He needed Dick to understand, to have a solution at the ready. The fog from yesterday was slipping over his conscience, but he fought it off, desperate to make progress.
Did you do this to yourself?
He hesitated at the question, before shaking his head again. It was self-inflicted in some ways, but not exactly of his own volition, like Dick was implying. Dick exhaled sharply, a frustrated sound that only made Damian more irritated.
You gotta work with me, because I'm going to get an answer one way or another.
He frowned. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him.
I'm worried about you. How did this happen?
Damian stared at him, a desperation for Dick to point out the obvious. And finally, he did.
Can you talk? I mean, I've heard you speak, but actually talk. I don't really remember.
His voice trailed off lamely. Damian shook his head urgently. A breakthrough, at last. It had taken 2 weeks for someone who could actually be of any aid to say it to his face. His teachers had seemingly caught on sooner, even Cody of all people. How had the most untrained individual in existence noticed before his vigilante family? Inconceivable. And yet, the proof sat in front of him. Dick leaned back as if he'd been burned, with a stricken expression on his face. He put a hand over his eyes, massaging his temple.
Okay.
Dick let out a breath.
I can work with this.
Damian tapped on the table, trying to focus on the conversation. it was getting more difficult, and his anxiety only increased as he realized that this was surely a sensation that had overtaken him on many occasions before. He just hadn't noticed till now. Had the Nicentra, as his symptoms worsened, increasingly addled his mind? The curse and the Nicentra were different, with the curse itself causing his bruises and also the other magic overload issues. Nicentra was a consequence. In some ways, it was much worse than the curse seemed to be, as that didn't have deadly effects itself. Though he didn't even know if that was true. Molino wasn't a good reference. His research was minimal at best, though it was difficult, seeing as he couldn't exactly search up anything. The word Nicentra didn't pull up any results when he had tried before, and he figured the pain involved with typing out a more specific sentence wasn't worth it to probably get 0 results. When it came to magic, books tended to be the way to go. His mind returned to the ripped page in the library. It could have been meaningless, and really, it most likely was an unimportant page, but it had been odd all the same.
"You there?"
Dick asked. He looked concerned, and Damian blinked a few times, realizing he'd spaced out. Again, he'd lost himself in his head, allowing his thoughts to wander and rob him of the present.
"Come on, look at me."
Dick reached out as he parroted his early words, slowly placing a hand on Damian's head. It was grounding, enough so that he could register Dick's words at least.
"Do you not want to talk?"
"Difficult," Damian rasped, and wasn't that a simplification? Pain flared up on his shoulder, throbbing as new bruises always did. It burned just like the realization that he was utterly without control.
"What do you mean by that?"
Dick tilted his head.
"Did something happen? Does it have to do with the bruises?"
There were too many questions at once, but he still nodded, hoping it would give his brother some sort of hint, something for him to glean.
"And you can't tell me what happened?"
Dick confirmed, as if Damian hadn't already implied that.
"Is there anyone who would know? Leah, maybe?"
Damian huffed. His emotions were controlling him, his fists clenched at his sides. He reminded himself that Dick didn't know what to ask, what the right questions were. He was in the dark, and Damian couldn't do much to help him out.
"You're not alone. You know that, right? And even if you don't, or can't tell me or anyone what's wrong, we all want to help you. I need you to try and cooperate when you can, but
His voice cracked.
I don't know how to help you if you won't try too. You don't get to handle this alone. Whatever's going on, you're not alone in this. Got it?"
Damian felt an ache in his chest as he nodded, grateful that he couldn't speak because he knew he might have broken down right then, allowed himself to let loose everything that had built up, everything he'd worked so hard to keep hidden. And while that might have been the goal, to reveal the truth of everything, Dick didn't need the burden of Damian's inner turmoil. That wasn't his problem. It was Damian's cross to bear.
"Okay, you can't speak?"
Why did he insist on confirming what had already been established? They were running in circles.
I know, I just...
Dick sighed. He looked sad. Overwhelmed, maybe. How could he not? When Damian had given him nothing but trouble.
"I'm pushing. Sorry. Alfred packed your sketchbook, right? You can draw on that right now, maybe. Or we could watch a movie."
Damian wasn't partial to any of those suggestions, but he didn't have much else to do, and Dick was looking more pathetic than normal. He was out of his depth, it seemed. How do you solve a case with no evidence? Damian's family could do it, but it wasn't an instantaneous thing. And so, as he sat down on Dick's couch, curling into himself, he pointedly ignored the constant glances Dick took to his phone. He was clearly texting someone, probably a whole slew of someones, and Damian had a feeling it involved him somehow. He needed a plan of action. It was harder than it should have been to come up with workarounds to the curse, even when he knew what he wanted, knew he needed a solution to the curse. His mind simply couldn't stay focused. Just a few weeks earlier, he'd had a litany of ideas, too many for even him to keep track of. But right now, his head was quiet, empty.
Tim and Cass found a lead for the fire, you know,
Dick said suddenly, his eyes lifting from his phone.
Apparently, some guy was walking past the building you and Tim were held captive in, after the police cleared out, and saw somebody lurking around. They're actually trying to get a description right now.
Damian nodded along. Dick was just trying to distract him, obviously unaware of how closely related his silence was to the burned building. He didn't have much to go on, but the odds were that Melina was involved somehow. The kidnappers had been confused, and the fire was set off without any rhyme or reason. He'd be more surprised if she wasn't the culprit, or at least knew something about it. He considered trying to find Melina again. If he could lead someone to her, then everything might fall in place. While most of the others would have no clue who she was, Tim would recognize her from the gala. At the time, he had commented on her strange behavior. Damian figured Melina wasn't exactly tight-lipped, and surely he could get her to say something incriminating. Hopefully, before she disappears again.
The hearing is the day after tomorrow. I got a court order to come, so Cass or Jason might be in charge of you for a couple of hours. Alfred has to vouch for your dad, so he can't take you. But is that okay? I could probably arrange for you to see John, maybe, instead. I'm sure Clark and Lois would be fine with that.
The custody hearing. Of course. He knew the legal process vaguely. This was likely only the first in a long and drawn-out court case. Damian didn't want to see anyone, but he'd rather not deal with the bombardment of questions he was sure John would have, and keep his interactions closed off to the people who were already involved. Dick grinned.
Maybe Cass and Jason together would be better. I don't want my apartment to burn down.
Damian rolled his eyes, his attention back to the screen. He didn't care who came. It didn't really matter anyway. He attempted to keep his focus on the curse and his plans to thwart it. But his head hurt, and it was easier to let the world fade away. Constantine pushed himself up. He felt groggy, his clothes having collected dust that he brushed off with shaky hands. It seemed he'd been asleep, or dead, something in between. For how long? He wasn't quite certain, but the ache in his frame gave an indication that it hadn't been a short nap. He glanced around, trying to remember how he'd gotten there as he took stock of the situation. It seemed he had been stuffed into a closet, coat hangers dangling above him. An ironing board was tucked in beside him, a white bathrobe hanging limply adjacent. Overall, it was cramped, and he couldn't wait to exit. Light flickered underneath the door, smoke drifting up. He grimaced, aware that he'd need to get out quickly, unless he wanted a more singed look to his hair. He felt his face and noted the grown-out stubble propagating. Constantine couldn't help but groan as he stood up, looking around for the satchel he's pretty sure he had been carrying. He paused. A memory hit him, of wine and long limbs, ending with a stolen book and a floating orb. He cursed under his breath. Melina, his book, and damn! Had he really embarrassed himself like that? Was a pretty face all it took to defeat him? He would never live that down if he got out. Scratch that. There was no if, as Melina and her luminescent friend had made their intention to wreak havoc on Gotham pretty clear. as if the city needed more supernatural occurrences flooding in. Constantine sighed, resigning himself to his fate in the week to come. He stretched out his limbs as he prepared to burst through the door and hightail it out of there. Seeing as he'd created such a mess, he surely had some responsibility to resolve it, if only to avoid Batman's ire. And more importantly, retrieve the book. It would easily garner a high price, or at least provide ample spells to note down. Mainly, he wanted to thwart Melina's plan, because of the state she'd left him in. He was petty, sue him. Unsurprisingly, he had woken up sapped of most of his energy. It would take time to recover, and he had no plans to waste any more of it. His hand fumbled for any sort of crack in the door, but of course, there wasn't a handle on the inside of the closet, because what moron would get themselves trapped in one? Beside himself, that is. Constantine figured they hadn't been accounting for the potential of somebody luring a poor, innocent man to a room to steal his magical instruction book, with the help of some druid who had taken on the form of a light bulb. He pulled back his arm and tried to ignore the possibility of knocking his shoulder out of its socket as he rammed himself into the weak point of the door. It groaned against the force, and he slammed against it once more. It flew open at an impressive speed, the flimsy lock finally giving way against his body. His eyes watered as smoke and ash streamed in. Constantine crouched low to the ground as he crept through the room, which seemed to have caught fire, if the whole smoke thing hadn't already made that obvious. A window was situated close to the closet, and he felt immense gratitude for the building codes as he pulled it open and found a fire escape. With one last forlorn look for anything he might have left in the room, he pulled himself out of the window. Constantine didn't remember putting all of his clothing back on. He supposed he had Melina to thank for that, but she hardly seemed deserving of his gratitude, seeing as she'd left him there. He made his way down, dropping into an alley. Turning the corner, fire engines were blaring their lights, and a small crowd of tired hotel guests was gathered at the front of the building. Just from glancing back up to the hotel, he had an inkling of where the fire had originated. Constantine slipped out of the alley and quietly approached a man standing a bit farther from the crowd. "Bit warm, isn't it?" The man startled, his gaze having been fixed on the fire beforehand. He was handsome, in a blasé type of way, probably some sort of office worker, and on any other night, Constantine would have more witty and flirtatious banter at the ready. However, he felt that he was finished with any sort of romantic conquests for the moment. He looked at Constantine, a grimace on his face.
"Yeah, I'll say. Geez, I hope they get it under control before it starts to spread. These buildings are all pretty close together."
Constantine hummed.
"Sorry, you wouldn't happen to know the date, would you? My brain isn't working like it should this late."
He faked a confused expression.
"September..." The man laughed. "I guess nighttime really isn't your thing. It's October 5th.
He glanced at his phone screen.
"Ah, I guess it's actually the 6th now. I wonder if there's a motel open this late."
Constantine let the man mutter to himself as the information sank in. It couldn't be true. Why, that would mean he'd been out for 3 or 4 weeks. A whole month. And he'd wasted it all shoved in a closet? He was more surprised that no one had found him in that time frame. While he may usually be a loner, at least the hotel staff should have found him. Though he had a feeling that had more to do with the spell Melina had cast than anything else. A surge of anger coursed through him. Time wasn't returned so easily. A month was spent on a dirty floor, and he'd make her pay for that. He took a step back, noting the flames flickering out of the hotel. Constantine wasn't eager to attract attention. A whole city block burning down from a magical fire would do just that. He wasn't certain why it had started, but he figured it was the Fae's work. He sighed and told himself this was only to test if his power still worked, as he muttered a quick incantation. not to put out the flames. That would be too obvious, and too much effort, really. But they were no longer using magical energy to function. It would make the firefighters' work much easier anyway. He wasn't a full bastard. Only half. Not that there was such a thing as a half-bastard, but he managed it all the same. Constantine shoved his hands in his coat, stalking off to find a place to lay low as he gathered information and energy. From what he recalled, Melina had mentioned something about Samhain. That was when the spirits were supposed to be closest to the mortal realm, and when ley lines tended to pick up in strength. So he had until the 1st of November to put an end to her druid resurrection in Gotham. Surely he'll have finished her off by then. He wondered idly if he should contact Batman in the coming days. The vigilante would know immediately when Constantine entered city limits, and he couldn't imagine him to be particularly excited at his appearance. He fumbled around his pockets, looking for a loose cigarette. Really, how much chaos could Melina have caused in a month? Alfred let out a sigh as he made his way through the manor's property. Titus was trotting ahead of him, his tongue hanging out of his mouth as he happily meandered through the manicured lawns. His mind was fixated on Damian. Alfred hoped it really had been due to nerves that he'd been sick, but it was hard to say. He had instructed Dick to keep an eye on him anyway. The bruises flashed in his mind, and he grimaced at the memory. He should have confronted Damian much sooner, but he'd only warned the others, taking a more cautious approach as he assessed the issue. Damian usually came to him for advice when he was having problems. Alfred had gotten comfortable with that routine, complacent with the assumption that things would work out. Titus's bark startled him. It echoed through the gardens, and he pulled on the leash as he led Alfred to a large tree. He squinted up at it, wondering what had gotten Titus's attention. There, high above them, a crow circled ominously. It seemed to be protecting its nest. Something golden flashed above. They weren't usually solitary animals, but Alfred had other things to worry about than a bird. He pulled Titus away, but he couldn't help but glance up one more time. The crow seemed to stare down at him. Its eyes flashed white, and it must have been the sun's glare. As he walked back towards the manor, Alfred pushed aside the feeling that something wasn't quite right. And that is the end of Chapter 16 of The Sound of Damian Wayne. Author's notes. Constantine's bit is a continuation from the chapter before, so the same night as the prior Chapter 15 events. The plot seeds are growing. I can't remember what the last Constantine chapter was. Was it Chapter 15 or was it Chapter 14? I feel like it was 14. Anyways, continuing on with author's notes. I don't have much to say this time around. I guess for author life updates, I'm committed to college. I mean, that was true last update as well, but I'm still excited about it. I want to actually take creative writing courses, which will improve my fics. So, yay for readers! Maybe not so much for Damian, but I have that to look forward to. If you ever have any questions, to clarify, or if you just want some extra information, send me an ask on my Tumblr. I promise I'm nice. And the Tumblr, I believe, is Magnoliabee. I keep seeing comments that people have actually cried reading this. If that's the case for you, reader, I apologize somewhat, but I'm extremely proud to have had that effect. Reader's notes. I'm losing track of time. Was the last chapter Constantine? I thought it was like chapter 14 or 13. They all just blend together. It can't have been last chapter. No. It was something before that. We're almost caught up to where the author is currently. Next is chapter 17, then 18, and then we're done with the podfic until the author updates, which I'll be posting as they update, or shortly after they update. Yeah. Also, the author finally posted, the end number of chapters, which is 25. Supposedly, it may change, But that's cool. We know a potential endpoint for this. Don't know how long that'll take. But yeah. If you guys want to have discussions about this fic in the comments, I would highly appreciate that. Anyways, remember to leave kudos, likes, comments, whatever. Yeah. Thanks for listening. Bye!